5 terrifying tales from the night shift, stories that will leave you questioning the darkness just beyond your vision, the shadows that dance at the edge of your perception. Prepare yourself, because once you've stepped into the darkness with us, you may never truly find your way back to the light. The air hung heavy and silent in the deserted parking lot, the only sound the distant hum of the city lights barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. It was 3 a.m., the witching hour, when shadows stretched and twisted, taking on lives of their own. Michael, a lone security guard, made his rounds, his footsteps echoing eerily off the concrete pillars that stood like sentinels in the night. He'd been doing this job for years, but tonight something felt different, the silence almost suffocating, pressing in on him like a physical weight. His flashlight cut a swath through the darkness, illuminating rows upon rows of empty vehicles, their windshields reflecting the pale moonlight like vacant eyes staring into his soul. He shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled upon him like a shroud. Each step he took, each rustle of the wind, each creak of metal from the nearby construction site sent shivers down his spine. It was as if the very air was alive with anticipation, a silent symphony of dread playing out in the stillness of the night. He reached the security office, a small prefab structure that sat like a lonely island in the sea of empty cars. Stepping inside, he flipped on the light, the sudden brightness a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness outside. Taking a seat in front of the bank of security monitors, he began his usual routine, scanning each camera feed for any signs of trouble. It was then that he noticed it. On camera 4, a dark figure standing motionless at the far end of the lot. His breath hitched in his throat, a cold knot of fear forming in his stomach. He zoomed in on the figure, but the image pixelated, making it impossible to make out any distinct features. It was just a silhouette, a void in the darkness. But something about it felt deeply, unsettlingly wrong. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination playing tricks on him in the dead of night. But deep down, a primal fear whispered a chilling truth. Something was out there, watching him. His gaze darted between the figure on the monitor and the actual parking lot outside. Each time he looked back at the screen, the figure seemed to have moved closer, its progress slow, deliberate, almost predatory. Panic began to claw at the edges of his composure, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He tried to focus on his job, on the other cameras, but the figure on camera 4 held him captive, its presence a black hole sucking in his attention. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, hunted, that every time he looked away, it was drawing closer. Minutes stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow to his nerves. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the hum of the monitors and his own ragged breathing. He knew he had to do something, had to confront whatever was out there before it got any closer. He grabbed his flashlight and baton, his hand trembling as he gripped them tight. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, but the fear, the primal, instinctive fear, had him firmly in its grip. Mustering every ounce of courage, he threw open the door and stepped out into the night. The cool air hit him like a slap, momentarily clearing his head. He shone his flashlight across the parking lot, the beam cutting through the darkness, searching. He scanned the entire area, his heart pounding against his ribs, but there was nothing. The figure was gone. He let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him, but it was a fleeting feeling, quickly replaced by a chilling new wave of dread. As he turned to go back inside, his gaze fell on his reflection in the glass door of the security office. He froze, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The reflection showed the office behind him, the chair, the desk, the monitors glowing in the darkness. But his reflection was missing. And then, from behind him, from the very air itself, he heard a whisper, barely audible, yet chillingly clear. "You shouldn't be here." The year was 1987, and the old wing of Mercy Hospital stood cloaked in a silence as heavy as a shroud. This wing, with its peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights, had been closed for decades, its rooms left undisturbed, haunted by the memories of those who had passed through its doors. Sarah, a young nurse working the night shift, made her rounds in the adjacent operational wing. The air hummed with a low, unsettling energy, a feeling amplified by the fact that she was completely alone. She had heard whispers about the old wing, stories whispered among the staff in hushed tones, tales of patients who had checked in but never checked out, of unexplained noises and cold spots that sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened medical professionals. As she passed by the sealed-off entrance to the old wing, a shiver ran down her spine, and she couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching her, their gaze cold and predatory. Returning to her station, the sudden shrill ringing of the phone startled her. Catching her breath, she picked up the receiver. Nurse's station, Sarah speaking. A long pause, then a crackling voice, thin and reedy, whispered from the other end, "Nurse, help me!" "Room 309. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, a chill crawling up her spine. Room 309. That was in the old wing. It had been empty for years, locked up and untouched. She checked the switchboard, but there was no record of the call. Logic told her it was a prank, a cruel joke played by one of the orderlies. But something in the back of her mind, a primal instinct, whispered a different story. The voice had been weak, desperate, laced with an undercurrent of something ancient and deeply unsettling. Her curiosity piqued, and against her better judgment, Sarah found herself walking towards the old wing. She told herself she was just being thorough, that she had to check just to be sure. But deep down, a part of her knew she was being drawn in, pulled towards the darkness by an unseen force. The air grew heavy and cold as she stepped into the old wing, the smell of decay and disinfectant assaulting her senses. Dust covered everything, thick cobwebs hung from every corner, and the silence was broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the distant drip of a leaky faucet. She reached room 309, its door slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning her forward. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding in her ears. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering light bulb, the air thick with dust and the weight of forgotten memories. The bed was perfectly made, the sheets white as snow, as if someone had just been lying there. On the bedside table lay a glass of water, the water still and undisturbed, and on the floor next to the bed lay a single, discarded patient bracelet. She bent down and picked it up, wiping away the dust to reveal the faded inscription. John Doe. Discharge date, October 31st, 1958. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the room tilting beneath her feet. She stumbled back, dropping the bracelet as if it burned her. How could there be a discharge date from 1958? This wing had been closed for decades. As she turned to leave, her blood ran cold. The call light above the bed, the one that had been off just moments ago, suddenly flickered to life, bathing the room in an eerie red glow. And then from the shadows in the corner of the room, a voice, soft as a whisper yet as cold as death itself, uttered a single word. Sarah. Sarah didn't wait to hear anymore. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind screaming. She ran as if the hounds of hell were on her heels, the whispers of the dead echoing in her ears. She never went near the old wing again. And to this day, whenever she hears her name called in the dead of night, she can't help but remember the patient who wasn't there, and the chilling whisper that still haunts her dreams. It was a typical night shift for Mark, the kind where the silence was broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional chirp of the credit card machine. Out here in the middle of nowhere, nestled between a sleeping town and a highway stretching into the unknown, his only company was the occasional truck driver looking for a refill and a bag of chips. Tonight, however, that silence was about to be shattered. A figure emerged from the darkness, a silhouette against the backdrop of the night sky. He was tall and slender, his features obscured by the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. Mark felt a familiar unease creep up his spine, a feeling he'd learned to trust after years of working the graveyard shift. There was something off about this newcomer, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The bell above the door jingled, announcing the stranger's arrival. He moved with an unsettling stillness, his footsteps completely silent against the linoleum floor. As he approached the counter, Mark noticed the man's clothes, a long coat and trousers that seemed to belong to a different era, faded and worn as if pulled from the back of a dusty closet. "Evening," the man rasped, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to cling to the stale air of the gas station. "Could you tell me how to get to—" His voice trailed off, the question left hanging in the air like an unspoken threat. Mark could only stare, his mind struggling to process the unsettling presence that now stood before him. How to get to— where? Mark finally choked out, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger's lips curled into a humorless smile, revealing teeth stained a sickly yellow. He leaned closer, the smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something akin to damp earth, filling Mark's nostrils. "Galen's Ridge," the stranger finally replied, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate in Mark's chest. Which way to Galen's Ridge? Mark's mind raced, trying to recall any mention of a Galen's Ridge on the maps he'd studied during his lonelier shifts. There were no towns, no landmarks, no indication that any such place existed within a 100-mile radius. "I'm sorry, sir," Mark stammered, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn map he kept beneath the counter. "I've never heard of a Galen's Ridge. Are you sure that's the right name?" The stranger remained silent, his gaze fixed on Mark with an intensity that made him squirm. He unfolded the map with trembling hands, his finger tracing the faded lines of forgotten roads. "Maybe I can help you find it if you can tell me something else, anything else about it," Mark pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. The stranger continued to stare, his eyes two black pits that seemed to drain the light from the room. Then, without warning, he chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that sent chills down Mark's spine. "Galen's Ridge," the stranger repeated, his voice a hollow whisper. "You wouldn't know it. It's a long way from here." And with that, he turned and vanished into the night. Mark was left trembling, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him, the unsettling certainty that something was terribly wrong. He rushed to the security monitors, his hands shaking as he rewound the footage. He needed to see that man again, needed to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind. But as he watched the grainy footage, a cold wave of terror washed over him. The parking lot remained empty, the stranger's arrival and departure completely absent from the recording. Panic clawed at Mark's throat. He scanned the footage again and again, but there was no sign of the stranger, no trace of his presence except for the lingering smell of damp earth and the echo of his unsettling voice. It was as if he had never existed, a phantom that had materialized from the darkness and vanished just as quickly. Mark stumbled back from the monitors, his mind reeling. He was alone, truly alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a mystery that defied explanation. He had been certain that the security cameras would provide some kind of answer, but they had only deepened the mystery. Who was that man, and how could he have vanished without a trace? Mark spent the rest of his shift in a daze, his mind replaying the stranger's visit on an endless loop. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following his every move. The silence of the gas station, once a source of comfort, was now a suffocating blanket of dread. As dawn approached, casting long shadows across the empty parking lot, Mark felt a sliver of relief. He counted down the minutes until his replacement arrived, eager to escape the confines of the gas station and the haunting memory of the night before. He just wanted to go home, to feel safe again. Just as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the darkness, Mark's relief turned to ice. He noticed something he hadn't seen before, something that sent a fresh wave of terror crashing over him. Resting on the counter beside the cash register was a single withered flower. Its petals were a sickly yellow tinged with an unnatural shade of gray. Mark recognized the flower instantly. It was the same type he had seen growing along the side of a lonely stretch of highway, miles from any town or settlement. He had never seen another one, not until now. As he reached out to touch it, a cold, dry whisper seemed to echo in his ear. "See you tomorrow." Chapter 5. The Warehouse That Whispers. The night shift at the warehouse was never exactly a party, but this was different. The air itself felt heavy, like it was holding its breath, full of unspoken things. Every clink of metal, every rustle of cardboard echoed in the silence, twisting familiar sounds into something sinister. I was halfway through my inventory when I first heard it. A whisper, soft and low, somewhere behind me. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. For a moment there was nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, I heard it again. This time closer. My blood ran cold. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but the aisle behind me was empty, just rows and rows of silent boxes stretching back into the darkness. It had to be the wind, I told myself, or maybe some pipes rattling. But deep down, a knot of unease tightened in my gut. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to focus on my work, to ignore the whispers that seemed to slither from the shadows. But the silence was broken again, this time by the distinct sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the far end of the aisle. My blood turned to ice. I knew I was alone in the warehouse. There shouldn't be anyone else here. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each step sending a fresh wave of terror through me. I grabbed the nearest shelf for support, my knuckles white as bone. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could do was watch in horror as the shadow of the unseen intruder stretched out from the end of the aisle, reaching towards me like a grasping hand. Then, just as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy with unseen menace. I waited, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I was frozen in place. Then, a soft, chilling laugh echoed through the empty aisles, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I didn't wait to hear any more. I bolted, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I ran blindly through the maze of aisles, boxes toppling and crashing behind me, the echoes of my own fear chasing me through the darkness. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right behind me, its cold breath on my neck. As I rounded a corner, something slammed into me from behind, sending me sprawling to the concrete floor. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my mind racing. I scrambled to my feet, expecting to see, I don't even know what, but there was nothing there. Just another empty aisle, stretching out before me like a bad dream. Then as I picked myself up, I felt it again. A cold, unseen hand brushed against my shoulder, sending a shiver down my spine. I whirled around, my scream echoing through the empty warehouse, but there was still no one there. I was surrounded by nothing but shadows and silence, but I could feel it, watching me, toying with me. I didn't hesitate. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, my legs screaming for mercy. I could hear the whispers following me, taunting me, urging me on. The warehouse seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of endless aisles and suffocating darkness. Finally I saw it. The exit. A beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. I surged forward, my hand reaching out, grasping for the door handle. It swung open and I stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. As I started the engine, I could have sworn I heard a whisper, faint but clear, carried on the wind. "See you tomorrow?" Chapter 6. The Security Camera Nightmare. Another night, another graveyard shift at the mall, just me, the endless rows of security monitors, and the faint hum of the ventilation system. It was boring, sure, but at least it was predictable, or so I thought. It started with a flicker on one of the screens, camera 17, monitoring the east wing. Nothing major, just a momentary glitch. But something about it caught my eye. I rewound the footage, my gaze drawn to the darkened storefront of Elegant Designs, a high-end clothing store that had closed down months ago. And that's when I saw it. Standing in the middle of the empty store, stark against the polished marble floor, was a figure. Tall and slender, draped in what looked like a long, flowing coat. I couldn't make out any features, not in the grainy black and white footage, but I could feel a chill crawl up my spine. The store was supposed to be empty. The alarm system was still active, no one should be inside. I grabbed my radio, my pulse quickening. "Dispatch, this is security, do you copy?" Static, of course. The one night the damn radio decides to crap out on me. I considered calling for backup, but what was I gonna say, that I saw a blurry figure on a grainy security camera? They'd think I was nuts. I grabbed my flashlight and headed towards the east wing. My footsteps echoed in the eerie silence of the deserted mall. As I got closer, I could hear the faint hum of the alarm system outside Elegant Designs. Still active. Good. I tried the door handle. Locked. Double-checked the alarm panel. No signs of forced entry. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I peered through the glass into the darkened store. Empty. There was no one inside. I took a step back, my mind racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was the lack of sleep finally getting to me? I glanced back at the security monitor for camera 17. The screen was still focused on Elegant Designs, still empty. But then, my blood ran cold. Because standing right behind me, reflected in the glass of the storefront, was the figure. Tall, slender, and draped in that same long coat. And this time, it was staring directly at me. I could practically feel its eyes burning into my back. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corridor, the darkened storefronts, and the echo of my own fear. I checked the security monitor again. The figure was gone from the reflection, and then, the screen went dead. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my radio again, but it was still dead. The entire mall seemed to be plunged into an unsettling silence. The lights flickered overhead, and then everything went dark. I stood there, frozen in the sudden blackness, my senses on high alert. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart. After what felt like an eternity, the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the mall in an eerie red glow. I rushed back to the security room, my mind a whirlwind of questions. What had just happened? Who was that figure? And why was the security footage gone? I checked the system, my hands trembling. The power outage had caused a system malfunction. The last hour of recordings, gone, erased. As if the events of the last few minutes had never happened. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank screens, a cold dread settling in my stomach. I had a feeling I wouldn't be getting much sleep tonight. Chapter 7. Outro. The Night Shift. A time when the world sleeps and the shadows grow long. We think we're alone, safe in the darkness, but what if we're not? What if the things that go bump in the night are closer than we think, lurking just beyond the edge of our vision, waiting for their moment to strike? The next time you find yourself alone in the dead of night, listen closely. Pay attention to the shadows, the whispers, the things that seem just a little off, because you never know what might be watching you from the darkness. The night shift is a different world. The silence, the emptiness, the shadows. Maybe it's just our imagination playing tricks on us. Or maybe, just maybe, the night belongs to something else entirely.